Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Well, here we go. It is Thursday, October the 24th. It's on the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast. And, well, we've got the crew back in studio here today. And there's plenty to talk about with the legislature being back in business now after a rather lengthy summer recess. And to hear the Premier talking yesterday on the radio, suggesting it wasn't time off. He was very busy in his 132-day recess, attending something like 400 events. And I don't doubt it. Based on what I saw on his LinkedIn page, and his team is very active on social media. And the idea that they are able to capture everything that he was doing, it very much looked like campaign mode. It certainly sounded like campaign mode this week in the legislature. So let's get at it. And we will welcome in. John Wright is here from Maru Public Opinion. And, of course, he's been sitting in the chair as long as I have on this show. So John and I kind of launched this off the back of a napkin one day. What do you think we should do, a podcast? Yeah, let's do a podcast. All of a sudden, we're doing a podcast. Here we go. Keith Leslie is here. He's a veteran reporter and commentator at Queen's Park, and he is the former Queen's Park bureau chief at Canadian Press, and he would have spent some time tangling with Mr. Hudak, Tim Hudak, the former leader of the provincial Progressive Conservatives, and as well as Kathleen Wynne, the former Premier of Ontario. So welcome in all, and I hope everybody has had a good week and a fun week as we get ready to get back into the maw of it all. I'm going to go to the two MPPs in the room right now. What's it like when, particularly after you've had sort of that long summer off, Tim? And I realize that there's work being done in constituencies and so on. And as the leader, it's a different level of intensity. But what's it like, coming back into the legislature after that time off? Everybody's sort of equating it to the first day back to school.
It kind of is, right? I actually sent that text to a few, former colleagues and still friends, saying welcome back to school. I'm interested what Premier Wynne has to say about this. I see it in two senses. One, look, it's an honor to be one of the MPPs that has the ability and the privilege to have one of those desks and to, use your microphone and your desk to advance issues you care about. And others are motivated the same way. So Dave, it's fun. It's good seeing everybody again. There's always an instant energy on all sides. For the sport of it too, right? What's the opposition leader going to ask? What are they going to target? The media then run with it. So on an interpersonal level, it's great and it's energizing and it's a lot of fun. On the higher level politics, I do worry that increasingly governments take longer recesses between the legislature. And why it's important is because question period is the strongest tool of the opposition, whatever party, to hold the government to account. And I think we've seen over time, certainly my time in politics, less time in the legislature, and that's ultimately unhealthy for good decision making.
Yeah, Kathleen, it's one of the things that it occurs to me, like everybody seems to be ready for the best question ever and the best answer ever, whether it's answering the question that was asked.
Well, isn't that sort of the first rule of media training too? That, you say what you need to say, but there are those of us who do try to answer the questions. And I think to Tim's point about the importance of the legislature, that is an opportunity for the public to get a glimpse of what people are saying, how they're saying it, what their priorities are really. And to the point of what it's like coming back, for me, much like what Tim has said, it was always great to see the people, because that's your team. You have your staff team, and when you're working in the constituency, it's hard work. And though it always used to bug me when the media would say, the politicians are off now on a break. It was work that we were doing in our constituencies and preparing for the debates of the day when we went back. But being back in the legislature with the team, it is a lot of fun. And there's and there's the ability to support one another and to advance whatever the agenda is that that's on our platform. So I really loved it, and I just wanted to comment on Tim's comment about the honor of it. You know, every single day that I walked into that building, it was there was a quality of pinch me, you know, like, really, is this really happening? So that it just never totally went away. So it's a terrific privilege.
Well, with the whiff of an election campaign in the air, John, and that whole pinch me idea around this, you know, if nothing else, the Liberals had a little bit to cheer about this week, just based on the results we saw in New Brunswick. Susan Holt is now the Premier designate in New Brunswick after the Liberals won, you know, going away. Unlike what's going on in BC, where not sure as we record this they've figured out who's going to form government there. But you know, there was always this thought that the Liberals are on this sort of extinction list. But you know, there's something to be said in terms of what happened in New Brunswick.
There are a few lessons there for everybody who follows politics. Number one, even if your federal party is unpopular to the degree that it is, you still can win with a winning campaign. You always look at the signs. The signs for this one were, it's a Holtz victory on the way. It wasn't a Liberal victory on the way, red signs, but it was all about her. Was very popular, and they're, you know, they now have the largest selection of women and francophones in that legislature, so it attracted new blood, new people. She also had some pretty key issues that she was running on, particularly on healthcare and giving bonuses to nurses, a very, very key issue down there. So part of it is about the campaign. The other lesson really has to do with if you're an incumbent party and how you are going to deal with things, and there are some parallels to what's going on federally. I mean, Blaine Higgs came in as a bit of a maverick and captured the attention of people to lead that Conservative government. He was good during the COVID crisis, but then afterwards there were some issues where he brought in some people who, from, you know, basically from the outside of the party, who represented some more, you know, stronger views to the Conservative side. You know, it was the transgender issue that he took on. There were issues dealing with trying to get rid of French immersion in the province. I mean, and more importantly, he lost a lot of cabinet ministers. People picked fights, resigned, and there was basic chaos. So it was time for a change there. So you don't rule anybody out in politics, particularly given today's volatile circumstance. But there were some seeds that were planted by Blaine Higgs in the last parliament that they had that really didn't work very well for the party. And secondly, the campaign read the landscape really well, and it became her campaign as opposed to the Liberal campaign, dominated by her issues as opposed to the federal the Liberals. So she managed to get through, and it's going to be a very interesting time down there.
Well, and Keith, it seems to me there's sort of a parallel or a similarity between the way Tim Houston won in Nova Scotia, where he kind of went off brand too, or tried to dissociate himself from the Conservative brand in Ottawa, and that worked for them. So, you know, maybe the lesson here is that we can't sort of be painting this broad brush right across the country with, you know, red, blue, and orange, and just to suggest all of this is really localized.
Houston played it brilliantly. He, as you say, he didn't come out as a hardcore conservative or a progressive conservative either. He said the issue in Nova Scotia is healthcare, and I'm going to run a $500 million deficit to get healthcare addressed right away, right now. That's not a conservative position, but it was a winning position, and it absolutely helped sweep him into power. In New Brunswick here, I think, you know, Higgs blew it. And of course, he had a couple of caucus revolts going on, as John mentioned, and he didn't really get a handle on it. And he veered hard right. Whereas Holtz came in, she made 100 promises during the campaign. That's something that politicians tend not to do as much anymore. But she had some very specific issues she really wanted to address, and it clearly won over the people in New Brunswick. And it's, you know, it's a more moderate, as John put, more women in the caucus, more francophones in the caucus at a time when Higgs was basically, you know, shutting out the French language almost. So this is a bold move for New Brunswick to pick a Liberal at a time when the federal Liberals are really, really on the ropes. But, you know, it shows that you can run your own provincial campaign. You can distance yourself from the feds fairly easily and, you know, make your own headway, make your own campaign, drive those issues home. and it works, whatever your brand is. But, Trudeau's dealing with the Atlantic premiers, or the Atlantic provinces, rather, the only ones where the MPs are publicly speaking out against Trudeau. But it's because he won every seat in the Atlantic provinces. When you go all in, you better deliver. And he's not delivering right now. They've lost it. So I think provincial Liberals and provincial Conservatives can absolutely differentiate themselves from the federal parties, and as we just saw in New Brunswick, and win an election with it.
So, Kathleen, when you look at, and I saw your reaction to the New Brunswick win, and certainly Bonnie Crombie had a similar, yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker, we're ready to go. And but I mean, how much does that play in terms of sort of the reality of the war room, as opposed to this is cheering for the team from the sidelines?
Well, what made me really feel optimistic and happy about Susan Holt's win was, yes, she's a Liberal, and there are more women and Francophones. All of that was great, but she ran a very progressive campaign. The hard right turn that Higgs had taken on gender rights and kids' rights, that hurt him, and it made me feel optimistic about just about the country, because you've got Scott Moe in Saskatchewan and Danielle Smith in Alberta riding the same very conservative in a mean small C way. I mean that horse, and Susan Holt turned that over, and her energy and her positivity. She ran a Liberal campaign, a progressive campaign, and she won. And I feel really good about that. I think it bodes well for those issues in other provinces. Now, that it may be a one-off, it may just be because of her particular circumstance and the person she is, but it's certainly, I think, gives heart to people across the country who may be feeling a bit like, wow, we're really moving backwards in terms of human rights in this country. And I don't think that's actually where we want to go.
Tim, how much attention does the leader are you guys paying, though, to the way things are playing out across the country? Because again, trying to figure out what's going on in British Columbia, for example, is just almost impossible. And I don't know. God love it. I saw some comment online the other day after all this played out. They have the Dominion voting machines in British Columbia, right? So, I mean,
get my pillow.
Yeah, right.
To an extent, right? And not scale of 0 to 10, I'd probably give that about a 4. Often where it plays out, Dave, is you look at the tactics that may have been used. Was there something particularly tactical that was successful for that party that you could employ here? Ontario tends to be a bit of a leader of the national way, so I'm not sure how much happens in reverse. By way of example, the BC Conservatives used some of the folks who did the social media campaign that was so effective for Doug Ford when he won in 2018 in British Columbia. The other way it affects is just it reinforces, sort of your outlook. So Premier Wynne just talked about, her point of view is the country going to shift back to the more progressive side? The lesson that reinforced for me was people will say, if you can't run your own party, there's no way in hell you're going to run the province. And when I had the chance to meet Premier Higgs a few times, host him at an event in Toronto when he was visiting, clearly he just couldn't keep his caucus and cabinet united. Two-term government, you see that many folks that resign that aren't on board. Voters will say it's time for a change if you can't run your own ship straight.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into the whole federal drama because that has yet to play out. So maybe that's a couple of episodes from now that we'll have to sort of sift through the entrails of what's going on with the federal Liberals. All right, let's get to the matter at hand. And they were back in the legislature this week. And to the point that both Kathleen and Tim, you guys have made, is that we're in there, we're ready to go. There's a lot of energy. Saw that yesterday, I think, in the question period exchange between Marit Stiles and the Premier was on his feet yesterday. I don't think that might have been one of the first questions he answered in the legislature this week, but it sort of set the tone for the way things I think are going to go in the next 3 weeks or so as they sort of play it out and get to whether the economic statement's coming next week. Here it is.
And this is hard to believe, but follow along here. There are not 5, not 10, not even 15. But 82 Metrolinx vice presidents, 82 VPs and zero opening dates. Zero opening dates, Speaker. And they just keep getting these 300% raises while the Premier takes teachers and nurses and healthcare workers to court to freeze their wages. Why, oh why, does the Premier keep rewarding Metrolinx for failing to deliver to the people of Ontario?
Members will please take their seats. Premier?
Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition is so concerned about this, why did she vote against the largest transit project in North America? Why did she vote against reducing the cost of fuel that we know, God forbid, which will never happen, by the way, you're ever in government, you'll jack up taxes like you did before. Take money out of people's pockets. That's what you believe. You believe the government can spend the money better than the people. We don't. We believe in putting money back into people's pockets until they can go out for dinner, buy a pair of sneakers, maybe get their kids new clothes. When you and the Liberals were in power, they were in stress. You bankrupt this province. Companies were leaving because the environment wasn't there. High taxes, some of the highest in North America, the highest energy costs in North America, red tape and regulations. Well, my friend, we've changed all that. That's why we have become an economic powerhouse around the world. People are coming here from all around the world to invest and to live and to raise a family. We had record amount of people.
And that's why they call it question period, not answer period, right?
And then there's PTSD, Dave.
Oh, sorry if we triggered you guys. I apologize. But John, it gets to the point around, I think they clearly set the lanes here. If the opposition is going to do anything vis-a-vis, the get it done motive here, that's where she's going with it. I mean, I didn't know that. There are 82 vice presidents of Metrolinx. I mean, holy crap, right? And we still don't have, I see them testing the tracks on the crosstown, but we still don't have that open. It's a good lane to be in.
Well, it's a good lane to be in if you're a politician who wants to get some votes in Toronto. It doesn't really matter to somebody who lives in my wife's small village of Eganville, in the middle of the Ottawa Valley. So John Yakubuski up there doesn't have to deal with these sort of things, and what the Premier said matters more than that. So I think what was more important in that exchange is more of the run lines that we're going to see coming up into what may be an early election campaign. Not only is the Premier talking in a set of talking points that frame the party, but we now have new advertising which has gone to the air which basically mirror that. This is going to be about a party that's building, is keeping taxes low, is putting money back into people's hands. I mean, you can argue whether or not it's appropriate to give everybody $200 and not have it means tested, or use $3.5 billion to open a bunch of long-term care homes, all that sort of stuff. But it plays to his brand, and it plays to question period when, in fact, not many people watch it, but it actually is important to skate by some of these tough questions. The question that she raised is absolutely valid, particularly for those of us who live in this city. But outside of the city, where the Conservatives, in fact, have a strength, it's not so much a big issue.
But Keith, isn't it at the point of being able to say, listen, if you can't get that done, and it's all, what are you able to get done? And it's been years in the making. I mean, we know that they broke ground well before he ever sat in the Premier's chair, and still we don't seem to be any closer just to getting a date to open it. I don't know. I mean, I understand that locally it's not affecting people who are living in Sault Ste. Marie, but the point is that the image of this is not a good look.
Well, no, I mean, it may not affect people outside of Toronto, whether these transit line or projects get built as quickly or finally the Eglinton Crosstown actually opens in some date. But it is a concern to, I think, every Ontario taxpayer that Metrolinx, the provincial transit agency, has 82 VPs. What? I mean, that's just stunning. That's not an organizational chart. That's just rewarding everybody with a VP position, and all of them would have staff. It's just crazy, astronomically crazy expenditures. I don't know any corporation that would have that kind of people. So it's a fair question. What we saw, of course, Dave, you pointed out that it was rare to see Premier Ford up on his hind legs actually answering a question. Well, he didn't answer; he responded to a question, but he did that. He took all the questions apparently yesterday. Very rare for him to do, but again, he didn't answer many of them. He just fired back with his positions. His government's accomplishments and boasting what they've done and what they're going to continue to do. But you're right. I mean, they clearly laid out, Doug Ford's going to be all about the big ticket stuff, and the NDP and the opposition parties are going to try to hold him to account. I just want to say to Kathleen and Tim's point at the opening of the show, as a reporter at Queen's Park, where I got to have my office there, I had it there for 4 years in the 80s and then again for about 17 years at the end of my career. I felt like a privilege every single day too, walking into that building. It really is. I know I wasn't elected to anything. I had to fight to get the job, but I didn't have to win an election. But I did every day, and it just coming in that east wing where the wooden section and just the smell of the building, and it really did. It was a sense of history and a sense of purpose, and it meant a lot to me to be there. It really did. So I felt that was a privilege every day. Just wanted to add that.
Well, and there was a time when that gallery was rather robust. There are not nearly as many people in that gallery now as need to be there.
In the 80s, it was unbelievable. I would say it was probably 5 to 6 times the size of the gallery currently. It was just little cubby holes everywhere. In the turrets, there were 4 press everywhere. We were just tucked away in there. And question period is the big show time. Of course, there's a lot of work going on when the House isn't sitting, but when the House is sitting, it's a whole new dynamic. You've got 100+ politicians in the building and all their staff. There's a ton of issues. If you can't find stories there as a reporter, you really should be somewhere else.
Well, and one day we'll get into you talk about the turrets. I spent time in there with Bob Carr, and one day we'll do a whole show about Bob Carr. Actually, Bob Reed and I spent time in that turret with Bob Carr, so it would be good fun. Tim, let me ask you this. The Premier is very good at coming out and saying, listen, I hear you. We've made a mistake. We're going to course correct here. And as of today, Phil Verster is no longer the CEO at Metrolinx.
We'll see. We'll see if that one comes along. I'm happy to come back. There does seem to be some sort of hold there, right? That despite Metrolinx causing headaches for the Premier and Minister of Transportation on a almost daily basis, at least a couple times a week, that the ship continues on in the same direction. More on that later, if you like, Dave. I just want to make 3 observations on that opening. So it very much feels, it made me want to come back. It's like, I love those days, but it very much feels like the start of the third quarter. Now, we may not get a fourth quarter in this game. We may have the election in the third quarter, but you could see the attack line of the New Democrats and the attack line of the Conservatives. The Premier was on offense there, not defense. Sometime maybe we could talk about this. I'd be curious for the panel's thoughts. I like Marit Stiles a lot. I like the way she communicates. I like working with her. I like her personality. And I think she helps to modify what is the central weakness of the NDP, and that's ideology. It can be frightening. I think she softens that. But man, she's not getting the kind of traction I would have expected, considering the NDP has been leading the opposition now for six years. Third point, here's what happened after the camera, Dave. The New Democrats then went on and talked about a whole different array of issues. So at opening salvo on the 82 VPs, that faded away as they went through question period. I remember how much time as opposition leader we spent on opening day series of questions. There's almost a theme. It was our central critique of the government. Pretty hard to land a blow if you keep changing the topic you pursue in question period.
I think that's a good point, Kathleen, back to you. And I say this to people all the time, especially when we're talking about, messaging, et cetera. They get bored with their own voice sometimes in terms of, I've already said that. Clearly, people have heard it. Well, we make the point that unless you're watching the clips on YouTube or listening to podcasts like this, most people aren't really exposed to the length and the depth of the conversation that goes on there. So, good advice. Stay on point. I mean, should she have kept pounding away at that?
Well, I'm not really in the business of giving the NDP advice. But I think to Tim's point, I think it's it's really interesting that she hasn't had more traction over the time that she's been there, and I think that may be part of it. She's not identified with a particular issue or a particular message that has broken through. And I think what Tim said about the tactic may be part of that. I thought it looked like fourth quarter. It actually looked like the fourth quarter to me. I think what will happen is the premier who, I sat there for 4 years, from 2018 to 2022. He answered very few questions. He took part very little in question period. He referred all the questions if he was even there. So I think you're going to see him, come in, make a few, bold, have a few bold days, and then he'll revert to his previous strategy, because I don't think he's really interested in engaging in debate. He's interested in the fight for sure. It's about the politics for him, and that's great, and that's what we saw in that clip. But I think that all speaks to he's in election mode. He's thinking about the seat count. He's thinking about getting on the road and making sure that he's talking to people. In terms of policy, I think it's going to be one shiny object after another, and that's what we're going to see in question period.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Premier, very good observation. I think she's right. I think that the Conservatives, I changed my mind on this, they're actually in the fourth quarter. And the opposition appears still to be in the third quarter, right? They're doing the critique, but they're not offering the alternative. So I think the Conservatives are ahead of the game. And what's important to note, too, to keep the football analogy going, it's been 6 years. And by this time, a government after 6 years should be on the defense. But right now, I got to say, they're very much on the offense and moving the ball down the field.
Well, John, is that because there is a weakness, just a general weakness in the opposition? I mean, the Liberals have had a hard time since the Premier took over. And the NDP, for whatever reason, has had a difficult time finding its feet. Andrea Horwath seemed to be, I don't know, I mean, maybe COVID was an excuse in terms of she couldn't get enough oxygen to light a fire around anything. But there just seems to be this flat approach to it. He's had a free ride.
Well, to continue the football analogy, there've been a lot of plays in the field, but there's also been a lot of inadvertent mistakes on the field too. I mean, I think it goes to the fact that I don't get a sense of theme from either of the two parties and what they stand for. I think, when you go back and look at the NDP, and much to what was said just a moment ago, if you go into the legislature and you haven't got a particular theme that somebody can kind of go, that's what they stand for. And the same with the Liberals at the moment, then it leaves open an opportunity for the government to kind of move ahead and play whatever game that they want to play. I think, secondly, this will not be the first campaign for Marit Stiles and the NDP, and you would think that their ground game would probably be better, and they would probably have a better theme in terms of countering the Premier, but it's just not there. I'm a bit surprised, and I'd be interested to hear, those who have run political parties before, why there is not more of an aggressive thematic framing for, let's call them both opposition parties. I mean, Bonnie Crombie's out of the House, but it doesn't stop her from putting together her own bully pulpit and moving a framed message forward. I mean, what's happened here is very clearly, the big blue machine of this era is well equipped, well cached, well framed, and well meaning in terms of its own constituency to move forward. There's nothing standing in its way. So it's reflected in the polls where they're at close to 40 to 44% in the polls. To Tim's point, at this stage, you'd be expecting them probably around 35, 34, 36%. But they are stronger than they have been before. The approval ratings are good, and they've got a cogent message in terms of moving forward. So I think it really comes down to, if you're preparing for a campaign or preparing to take the field with your team, you've got to have a playbook. You've got to have everybody wearing the same sweater. You've got to have a sense of momentum. It is not there for the other two parties, and I don't quite understand why.
So where is that momentum then for the Liberals, Kathleen? Because, again, back to the analogy, we've got Bonnie Crombie on the sidelines holding water for everybody else.
Well, I think, I mean, I'm not part of the brain trust now in the Ontario Liberal Party, but I know that they're developing those themes. They're developing a platform. I think it's hard. It is hard to get. It's hard to get media coverage when you're the third party, for sure. I mean, we saw that We've seen that historically. That's not an excuse. That's just a fact. But you know, I think Doug Ford's been very successful in distracting from all those missteps, those mistakes on the field that John was talking about. You know, I think they have been really good at throwing up distractions, and there's lots that he should be on the defensive for. You know, the way he's dealt with long-term care, the way that he has dealt with environmental issues. There's a whole list of things that, I mean, education, there's not a classroom in the country that you, or in the province that you can go into where teachers and support staff will saying, oh, you know, everything's going fine, we've got the resources we need. That's just not the case. So there's lots he should be defensive about. He's thrown up distractions. He's really good at that. He's a hail fellow well met, and that has worked for him, and it will work for him until it doesn't. And I agree with all of the comments about, you know, there's going to have to be a cogent theme. I would say there isn't a cogent theme coming from the government, except that, you know, we're going to build stuff and we're good guys. You know, I mean, that's kind of the message. But you know, when the NDP and the Liberals do have their platforms in place, and I know for the Liberals there'll be a very strong and coherent message. I agree with you. That hasn't happened yet, and you know, fingers crossed, my fingers are crossed that'll start to emerge in the legislature over the coming weeks.
So Keith, when we talk about those, you know, that ability to kind of cut through, and the Premier gets, you know, looks you in the eye and tells you that I'm going to put $200 in your pocket, and then we find out, well, we haven't quite figured out how we're going to do that yet because we can't track everybody in the province. That part of the story is an important part of the story, but that's not necessarily what people hear.
No one's
they
gonna
heard
read
the
that.
$200 in my
I'm going
pocket.
to get my $200 when I get it. If I have to wait another month, I'm okay. I don't care what the process is. People just don't care about that. We've discussed this before on this podcast, going back to the last season, about why the Liberals and the NDP aren't picking the obvious low-hanging fruit and just going to town with it. In particular, I'm talking about the healthcare system, hospitals, overcrowded emergency departments, hallway healthcare, ambulance bay healthcare, all this kind of thing. We've even talked about what, you know, why doesn't and Bonnie Crombie was speaking about healthcare this week, so I'm glad to see her top on that issue. But I think it needs to be one that, you know, I say in question, you're driving every question with this, showing up outside a closed emergency department on a weekend and stacking it up outside with cases of beer. So we were able to buy these at the corner store on the way here, but you can't get into the emergency department. You have to drive another 60 kilometers to get to the next one. Those kind of themes would be easy. As I say, this is low-hanging fruit. The healthcare system is in a real mess. There are efforts to privatize it have caused all kinds of shortages and problems throughout the system. Bringing in, you know, paying, using OHIP fees, 3-4 times OHIP fees to bring the private sector in to get quicker delivery of services, as opposed to just providing more money into the public sector. Homelessness, all of this. Why aren't these are easy topics, especially for the NDP and the Liberals, to rally people behind. Kathleen listed off a number of topics that would be part of the platform, but they need something. One major rallying cry, John talked about the team all wearing the same sweater. We need one theme, and I think it's healthcare. I really think it's the most vulnerable issue they have, and just hammer away at it every single day at the different aspects of it that they've done wrong. I don't know why the opposition parties are all over the place in this. The 82 VPs is a great angle, but hammer it the whole hour. Spend the whole hour on that. It's the only way you're going to drive the story is to show to the media and to the public how important you feel it is. If you just drive everything, I know if you dig a hole and it's the wrong hole, you can be kind of lonely down there. But for the most part, if you focus that kind of attention on it, it's going to work.
Well,
Dave, can I just jump in? And
Yeah.
Keith, because Keith is absolutely right. But the question I would have is, because Adil Shamji has been doing some of that, Keith. You know, he's been doing pressers. He's an emergency room doc. He's brilliant. He's real. You know, he understands what's going on in the healthcare system. But Keith, how many reporters are going to go and cover the third party doing an event like that if we're not in an election campaign? And I think that those opportunities are actually going to increase over the next few weeks and months, because we're obviously in a pre-election campaign. But I think up until now, it's kind of hard to pull them out. I mean, I've watched press conferences, even ones that are held at Queen's Park, and the press are not coming because they're out covering Doug Ford eating a bee. You know, like that's kind of the dynamic. So I totally agree with what you're saying, Keith. It's just a matter of how do we get the attention? I think the pre-election campaign is going to pull that attention to the opposition party.
I will say though, eating a bee still works for the Premier, Tim.
I don't think he even ate the damn thing. What do I know?
It wasn't really a bee either. Right?
It was a mosquito.
Well, look, I mean, I'm a fan, and I've known the guy for a long time. He's been good to me, but Doug Ford is a phenomenon, right? Like, he has been tremendously successful. Kathleen had a good line there. His gut's going to work until it doesn't, and his gut is working as a very much gut-driven politician. Look, the guy had back-to-back majorities, retired the opposition leaders, and increased seats. I mean, that's like hasn't happened since the days of Leslie Frost. So that makes opposition harder. Bonnie Crombie's a new leader. It takes time to get your feet as an opposition leader. And while she's been in federal parliament, she's not been in the provincial level. And it's tougher for, I think, the Liberals because they don't have official party status, so they don't have the resources. My guess on the NDP, and I'd love to talk about some other time, but I think that they have an identity crisis. They've got, will be my grandfather's traditional New Democrats, nope for the working man, blue collar. That's where, my mom's side of the family came from. And then they've got sort of the more elite identity crisis type New Democrats. So I think this identity crisis between sort of two parts of the NDP party is hobbling them.
Yeah, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but it occurs to me lately, how long can the New Democrats be new? I'm just saying. I mean,
but to that point, Dave, I just want to raise something, and it maybe take us into another area. But I mean, the appointment of Jane Philpott to head up, the healthcare renewal system, if you want to call it that, her promise to get everybody a doctor is a coup. I mean, there are two groups of people who watch politics, and let's remember that she was a federal minister, that she's been at Queen's University, in this area, that she's likable, personable, authority. She understands politics. But there's two groups of people who are involved in politics. There's those of us who watch it all the time from the gallery and who participate in it. And then there's everybody else out there. When that appointment was made, I guess I turned to the rest of the gallery and it was kind of like, whoa, everybody goes back in their seats. What a great piece on this for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Premier can now say, look, you can go ahead and criticize me as much as possible, but look what I've done. I've got somebody who's taking this on. We're going to look in and make sure that, we're going to get doctors for everybody. She's, go and ask her. We're doing something to solve the problem. So there's a massive deflection from any criticism that might come. But the second thing is, the proof will be in the pudding. I mean, there's a lot of politics in this. She's got a lot of stakeholder negotiations to do. It's one thing to say you're going to get a doctor for everybody in the province and, start to put together a plan with all of this stuff. But you got to talk to the OMA. You have to talk to the registrars. You got to talk to the colleges. There's a lot of stakeholders at place here. So there'll be a time where she has to kind of figure out how to do this. But I just thought, for the first part, I didn't see that coming. And I just thought, again, going to the campaign notion of what this government is about, everything is infused that way, heading into what is either in the fourth quarter or going into it. I thought that was a master political stroke.
Well, and again, what was interesting about this, Kathleen Wynne, is that announcement came before they even turned the lights on in the legislature on Monday. So it kind of got lost, but it was under the radar. But back to the idea, finding the theme, and Keith made the point, it should be about healthcare. They kind of took the thunder out of the entire argument there.
Well, for the moment, I mean, here's what I think. I think that Ford has already decided he needs to put a whack of dollars into healthcare. So to Keith's point, healthcare is a huge vulnerability for this government, huge on a bunch of different fronts. So he's decided that in this next budget, he's going to put a whack of money into healthcare. And in the interim, appointing Jane Philpott kind of, as John says, deflects the issue away from him, and he can just point to her and say, she's working on that, talk to her, and we'll get back to you. So I think it was very smart. It certainly took Liberals by surprise. She had just been speaking at the Liberal AGM in London a few weeks before. There were a lot of us who were very, very surprised that this happened, that she took the appointment. And we'll see if what she wants to have happen is actually going to happen. But as I say, I think there's money that Ford has already earmarked for healthcare, and it's part of the strategy going into the election. And I'm not going to say that's not smart, because that it is addressing his vulnerability. We'll see how it turns out.
But it's 6 years in. It's 6 years into his mandate.
I know.
And the hallway medicine that he promised to end, it was an average of 1,000 patients a day being treated in non-normal rooms. Now it's 2,000 a day, average across Ontario. So in 6 years, he's done nothing. Now we're going to get a report. Maybe next. I think this is all performative. I mean, it's a great coup to get Jane Philpott for sure. But what's it going to actually solve before the election?
Keith, you want to talk policy, and so do I, and this is not policy. This has nothing to do with policy. Doug Ford doesn't care about policy. I watched the guy for 4 years. He does not care about policy. He cares about politics. That's all he cares about. He cares about the seat count. The day that I walked into the legislature after the 2018 election, he came across to shake my hand, which was very nice and gracious of him. But as soon as he shook my hand, he turned to Mitzi Hunter and said, "We're coming after your seat next time." Like it was about the politics. So the healthcare appointment is about deflecting in the interim and putting some money in. We'll see if it goes where it needs to go.
Well, when we look at it from that perspective, though, Tim, this sounds like the criticisms that governments just generally get, where they make announcements and then they announce what they announced before, and then we just kind of walk it down, slow walk it until we don't have to deal with it anymore. The meme I saw was that her appointment will end the day after the election.
You veterans are just so cynical. Just so cynical. You veterans of journalism and politics. Look, you may be right. I want to be a bit more hopeful here. Number one, I got a lot of respect for Jane Philpott. I think she's been a very strong leader. She knows her stuff. She's eminently qualified. In fact, when I was the CEO of AREA, we had her as a speaker to talk about leadership at one of our conferences. So I think it's a good person, very good person for the job. And I do hope that they empower her on something so important to Ontario families. And I'm also hopeful because, look, I realize I'm well past the halfway point when I say back in the day for the lead for half of my sentences, but I do like it when governments take people who are part of other political parties who have the talent to get a job done. Sean Conway, right, a legendary Liberal, had a big influence on energy policy in the PC government, of which I was part. Dave Cook from Democrats on education. Kathleen Wynne was kind enough to appoint me actually to one of her committees around energy use in houses. So I really do hope that we'll see more of this in the future. And I do hope it's on the positive course, because I do believe that Jane Philpott can make a difference when it comes to getting a primary care physician.
Well, John, the answer that the Premier will give to the question around, it's been 6 years, yes, but we're building hospitals and we're actually out there, focused on the infrastructure that needs to be there. Here's the other side of that coin. Jane Philpott can get out there and work as hard as she can, but she can't create doctors. So, that's really the issue. We have a shortage in terms of capacity, we have a shortage of medical professionals who are going to be able to treat all the Ontarians that need doctors.
But I agree with what we said. I mean, this is all about politics. I mean, to think of it, a former federal cabinet minister who is now appointed to head this up, and you're going to get Bonnie Crombie attacking the Conservatives for not doing a whole lot, and they're just going to turn, hey, it reminded me for a moment about Bill Davis talking to David Peterson in the legislature. He said, hey, go talk to your father-in-law. Look at that. It's an incredible foil. And I also echo what Tim says. I mean, she's incredibly capable. She's got a huge amount of credibility, and I hope that it's going to have an impact. But it's not going to have an immediate impact. Mm-hmm. And if you're heading into an election campaign, more to Keith's point, you got a choice. You're either going to stack up beer cases in front of an emergency board, and you're going to carry that through and saying, here's billions here and billions there when we need it elsewhere. Then, I'm not really sure how you carve out what you're standing for if the government keeps taking those pieces in the campaign away. So I agree with you entirely. As I said from the outset, $3.5 billion will buy a lot of long-term care homes. That demographic you've heard me talk about on this show many, many times. It is coming at us like a freight train. It is entirely predictable what's going to happen. And yet we're off with other shiny objects and putting money in people's hands. I'm more worried about what's going to be coming out of my pocket about 5 years from now if I have to start using a long-term care home. It's those are the more substantive issues, but it's not been the way in which the health minister has acted upon things. It hasn't been the way this government has approached things. And I'm not really sure they're going to be able to change their stripes anytime soon. So I think, again, we're headed into an election campaign, and this was, and I say from a politic point of view, it was a coup. I can't think of a better way to shut down opposition going after you for healthcare. Well, Kathleen Wynne, the other side of this coin, not to belabor the cynicism of the veterans in the room, but the idea that giving Philpott this role, and if we go to an election and the premier calls it tomorrow, that pretty much takes her out of the equation of ever having anything to do with whether she wants to run provincially or be part of that campaign.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it may not. We appointed Christine Elliott as patient ombuds, and it was a great appointment. And then she came back and ran again. So I don't think it necessarily does. But to your point about the time frame, if an election is called very soon or in the spring, there's not a lot of time for her to do anything substantial unless, as I say, they've already had a conversation and there's been a promise about a chunk of money that's going in. But, there's a big rabbit hole that we could go down in terms of healthcare policy here. But in terms of growing family docs, we're not going to grow more family docs in this province until the funding model changes for family doctors. And that was a big fight with the OMA that we were having before we lost government, because there's not a lot of sharing that goes on in the OMA in terms of, the fee schedule for family docs as opposed to for specialists. And that's a big contentious issue. And what Jane Philpott wants to do is change the model entirely. Well, that's going to take time, and it's going to take a culture shift in the medical profession. I'm not saying it's not possible, and I think it's where we need to go. She uses the Netherlands as an example. I lived there for 3 years. It's a great model, but that's not the model we're living with right now. So anyway, I think the time is very short, and it'll be very interesting to see whether she's actually able to accomplish something. There are a lot of high expectations for her, and I think it's a challenging job she's been given. We're kind of running out of the runway here, but before we go, I just want to point out that for everything that we have talked about in the last 45 minutes, all important, it's all key to what's going to happen in terms of the future of this province in the coming months and the next mandate. But I'll tell you, my actual barometer reading on what is the issue of the day is in the old boys hockey dressing room. And I was at the rink last night, and I'll tell you, the one thing that everybody was talking about, and it didn't matter what the side you were on, it was about the bike lanes. You can't get away without having a conversation about the bike lanes. And it was a very animated and thorough and knowledgeable discussion. And, there were those who were saying, I think we kind of have to have the bike lanes and there was a really good conversation going on. Kathleen Wynne, I don't think we're going to get out from underneath this anytime soon. Oh, just make it stop, Dave.
Make the bike lane stop?
No, make it stop. We are building infrastructure again in a culture that hasn't been used to it. And I'm not saying that there aren't some bike lanes probably that are in the wrong place. Fair enough, fine. But it's a city responsibility. It's an overreach on the part of the province. And I just think that, he wants to be the mayor of Toronto, and he's not. He's the premier of the province. And I think that we should let the city decide where their bike lanes should be. And I think we need more, not fewer bike lanes, because if we really want people to get out of their cars, they've got to have options. Transit is one, but you can ride your bike most days of the year in Toronto now. So, I just think that this is, again, I believe the premier wants to pick a fight with the mayor. It's been all lovey-dovey and cozy, and I think he wants a couple of fights, and this is one of them.
Well, it's the idea that these guys were just trying to get around town, Tim, was the issue, and it wasn't a matter of political stripe. It was just I'm so bloody fed up, and that is the pointy end of the spear. There are all kinds of other things, as we've said in past shows, that we could be doing to improve traffic, in the city of Toronto. But that has resonated with people.
Oh, yeah.
But the research doesn't support it. I'll just say that. The research does not support that it's bike lanes that are slowing people down. So there
But
you
his
go.
feels do. He's got the right feels about this.
Yeah, but the research, I mean, look, I've seen, I'm sick and tired of reading research that comes out of the Netherlands. I'm sick and tired of listening to
But
people
that's
who,
where the people ride bikes.
yeah, but look at our street. I mean, everybody's 50 plus age range here, and I don't see them lining up to jump on their bikes every morning to go to the supermarket and come back. I mean, the evidence is visible. 2% of the people in this city actually use bikes. 2%. I mean, the rest of them are trying to get around and have a living. They can't depend on any kind of infrastructure to get them. Like everybody goes, well, let's use transit. Really, I got on at Dundas the other night to come home, and by the time I got to Bloor, it was stopped at Rosedale because of an emergency for another hour. You can't depend upon it. You got crosslink switches down, and I walked to the end of my street at Eglinton and looked there, and there's like one cyclist that comes every hour. So the evidence to me is such that it's penalizing everybody else. And secondly, even the research that was done in Toronto it was supported by municipal dollars. It was headed up by a bike group. It was the Cycling Federation or whatever you want to call it. So, I mean, it's not about standing on corners with a stopwatch and saying, well, man, we've got an extra 4 minutes of travel time that's been eliminated by this. I'm all for public safety. I'm taking a position not as somebody who's a pollster, but somebody who lives in the city. I'm all for public safety. But it seems to me that since we've gone through COVID, where we've got, all of these restaurants that expand onto the street, we've had cut lanes down, we've got streetscaping going on. The promise was you can have these bike lanes, but it's going to come with an accessible transit system. And the last time I checked, Paris has had one for a lot longer than we have, and it goes everywhere. I can't see how you can get a political argument that says that bike lanes should just continue ramping up when people have no alternative. So I really think that the Premier is making political points, sure, but I don't know how you stop City Hall and say, look, let's be reasonable and figure out, we might be building for a city that's 20 years from now, but today is today. And I don't see too many 65 to 70-year-olds getting on their bike during the wintertime to go over to Sobeys to pick up stuff. They got to have a vehicle to do it, and they can't rely on public transit. So that's kind of my rant of the day, but I'm tired of seeing all these research things that reference every place except here and isn't put together in a consistent and I would say nonpartisan fashion.
I want to my desk.
I want to declare my conflict here. I'm a bicycle 65 to 70-year-old bicycle rider every day. I don't go to Sobeys.
Where? Your traffic is a little. You don't have as much traffic, Keith, and I give you that.
I did not do that in Toronto. It's wait until I left Toronto to do that. I would say, though, that I think that the way bicycle lanes need to be done is the way Paris has done it. Not bicycle lanes, bicycle streets. Just close some streets specifically to all traffic except bicycles and pedestrians. That's it. Bicycle lanes, I wouldn't ride in those in Toronto. I still wouldn't. It just does not feel safe to me riding along the Bloor, go over the Bloor. Not a chance would I go over the viaduct on a bicycle with that little painted. No chance. But there still is a need. And it's really, I think, this whole 2% figure, less than 2% of drivers. Well, of course, because it's just not worth it. They'd rather be stuck in traffic than riding a bike dangerously through the traffic. As I say, I think the way to go is literally designate, make Richmond two-way and make Adelaide bicycles only. Those sort of things. It can be done. It's going to have to be done eventually. But to John's point as well, the transit support is just not there. Not dependable.
I wanted to pound my desk for John Wright's rant. Like I was back in the house in the stuff of the Netherlands. Remember that line in Austin Powers? There's two things I hate in this world: people who are intolerant and the Dutch. It took me back to that old line. Look, I don't see as many people as I used to in the old gig, but I can tell you in the neighborhood in North Toronto, and talk about so much in Niagara, the bike lanes have really exploded as an issue. Whether it's proven or not, people definitely attach it to congestion and how hard it is to get around. I mentioned earlier about how Doug Ford is such an instinct politician. I remember being in rooms where I was leader of the opposition, and some people would meet me, would take a picture. It was nice. And then Doug or Rob Ford would walk in. It was like a combination of Taylor Swift and Elvis walked into the room. Like, just people would hoard onto them. He just soaks up what people say. He was actually at his weakest in his 6-year mandate when COVID closed things down. He was simply surrounded by staffers and didn't meet with real folks. I have no doubt that Premier Ford hears about this all the time in Toronto and probably the GTA, and I think it's working for him.
All right, well, we're going to leave it there, and I hazard to say there's an over and under on whether or not we're going to talk bike lanes next week. So, Tim Hudak, thanks for being here this week. Kathleen Wynne, it's always good to have your insight. John Wright, he's the permanent, he's like the permanent seat at the Security Council at the UN, and Keith Leslie, our resident bike rider. Thank you all for being here. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And just by the way, we're going to add an element to this that allows you to make a comment. And you want to leave us a message, you can leave us a voice message. There's all kinds of comment on the YouTube channel, which is great. Thank you. But if you actually want to have your say, and we'll include the comments, appropriately so, in upcoming shows. So watch for that in the show notes. There'll be a link in there for you to actually record your message and have a comment on what's going on here. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.